Nice Radio's Callaloo presents Just Another Look. Just Another Look is an innovative, exciting, albeit decidedly provocative and yes, certainly controversial, socio-political analysis of issues of a local, regional, and international nature. Just Another Look is heard only on Nice Radio, first aired on Saturdays at 6 p.m., with repeat broadcasts on Sundays at 9 p.m. You can always catch us on the World Wide Web, www.niceradio.info. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube. I am, of course, Keith Joseph. Today, dear friends, is Saturday. It is the 11th day of September 2021. Welcome to another edition of your favorite program, Just Another Look. We want to begin today's program by sparing a moment and sparing a thought for those people who lost their lives in the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers in the United States. There were, of course, people from the Caribbean. There were people from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. There were Vincentians who actually worked in that building, some of whom survived. But it is the sheer horror of what conflicts do cause in and around the world in which we live. And one would hope that Christians and people of all sorts of religious beliefs would have an understanding that ultimately we should be striving to live in harmony, to be always moving towards peace and understanding, all on the foundation of love. And so we spare a thought, we spare a moment for the horror of 9/11. Today being the 20th anniversary, and it is still so very fresh in our minds. But even as we think of the kinds of international conflict that gave rise to 9/11, we look at our own situation that is developing here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And you see how political conflict can give rise to significant challenges for the advancement of a society. Here we are in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and we have for so long prided ourselves as a democratic society. And we've watched years and years of struggle manifested from time to time in protest action. And we recall the challenges that the indigenous people must have faced in the days of conquest. We recall the experience of slavery, colonization, the struggles of the 1930s, the demonstrations that were part of that. We watched the struggles of those who identify themselves as quote-unquote the progressive elements in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Young Turks. And we watch how they have morphed into a sick, archaic, and decadent ruminants of the left and the leftovers. We saw them flirting around like flies buzzing around a decaying product, anxious to be part and anxious to take a leadership role in 2000. And we've watched the smooth transfer of power in March of 2001. We've watched and listened to those progressives after the victory of the Unity Labour Party in 2001. And as that institution, as Unity Labour Party and its government, observe their 20 years in office, we are saddened by the reality of what passes today for governance in our beautiful country. It has to do, perhaps more than anything else, with a recognition that power impacts leadership such that it is possible for leaders to ignore their own history, perhaps even to ignore their own writings, their own political philosophies, or perhaps it is that they're not ignoring it at all. Have we ever considered that all that has been put before us as political philosophy and ideals of the Unity Labour Party, all that has been written in manifestos and said on political platforms, that all of those may just have been a means ultimately to an end favorable to those who lead? That must be the fundamental question that confronts Vincentians today. 20 years on, and a ruling regime can be seen by an increasing number of people in Vincentian society, some of whom some of whom were with the Unity Labour Party in the demonstrations of 2000. As one individual said recently, I was there. I helped block the road in 2000. And those who are still leading the society today and who were there and who helped organize cannot believe that this is what Vincentian society has become. The difference between a James Mitchell administration and an Arnim Eustace administration that was prepared to listen to the will of the people and to allow for the smooth transition of power. That could now be interpreted 20 years later as political weakness, as political ineptitude. Because they dare not now say that the masses were correct in supporting the drive against the New Democratic Party in the April, May of 2000 when there were significant roadblocks. They dare not say now that was somehow justified as an increasing number of the Vincentian electorate took to the streets in support of the cause then initially of the teachers' union, the public service union, and ultimately a political cavalcade. Because to say that would then make today's response by the ULP leadership as a significant contradiction in its own philosophical approach to politics, and give a lie to all that we have been told then and now. You know, dear friends, significantly, in an earlier program some time ago, we said without fear of contradiction that if you really want to look at the state of governance in St. Vincent and the Grenadines under the Unity Labour Party and how it has deteriorated since taking office in 2001, one has only to carefully look at the white pillars on the hill going up the Sand Hill. That road that takes you up to the top of Sand Hill, coming from Annesville. Because when the Unity Labour Party came to office, they always had those pillars, and people are always running into them. But each time under the ULP that they seek to repair damage caused to those pillars going up the road to Sand Hill from Annesville, you recognize that no time at all, no attention at all has been placed to ensuring some sort of uniformity. Each new set of white pillars placed or replacing older ones that have been damaged appears to be different. They're either different in shape, different in height, different in size. And we said then, and we repeat today, that more than anything else is indicative of the sloppiness of what passes for governance under the Unity Labour Party. There is no sense of unity, really. There is no sense of uniformity. There is no care for aesthetics. It is all slip, shod. Just put it there. Just play that we know what we're doing. It doesn't matter how it looks. And that was the case even when the E.T. Joshua Airport was active. The same way that people were ashamed of having the incinerator as the first thing you see landing at the E.T. Joshua Airport, and the last thing you see when you're leaving St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And Marcus de Freitas used that so beautiful in 1984 in his political campaign. It's the same way Vincentians ought to have been ashamed over the years of the unity leadership. That when you're arriving into Kingston, you're moving into Kingston, you look at the lack of finesse, the lack of care, the lack of a sense of aesthetics. When you look at those, some crooked, some tall, some short, some fat, some thin, those awkward pillars leading you into our main city. That is what the Unity Labour Party represents. It is a reflection of the modus operandi of the Unity Labour Party. A lack of care, a lack of concern, slipshod, sloppy, decadent. That is what. So anytime you're going into or out of Kingston, look at those pillars. And perhaps it is instructive that the pipes that connect these pillars are painted in red. A reminder, living reminder of the colors of the Unity Labour Party. And just look at those pillars, at the sense of disorder, the absence of unity and uniformity, the slipshod nature with which they are constructed. It does not matter. When you look at the behavior of the Unity Labour Party today, in response to concerns, whatever you may think about the cause or causes espoused by those who take to the streets, utilizing their democratic right to protest, whatever you may think about it, you need to look at the response of a government that committed itself publicly to the development, the crafting of a consultative democracy. A government that prided itself on caring for the people. And then you have an understanding of the state we are in this St. Vincent and the Grenadines today. But there's so much that we can say about that over time. And we will. But there are other issues impacting this country that reflects on the inability of the Unity Labour Party to govern the country in the collective best interests that have to be dealt with. And one of those is education. And we want to remind you that since taking office in 2001, the Unity Labour Party has this way of trying to give the impression to the Vincentian public that they have been and are making an all-out effort to show themselves to be a sort of quote-unquote education government. They even talk this rubbish and have their minions repeating the garbage about there having been a quote-unquote education revolution in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. There has never been really any education revolution in the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Ask the historians, they will tell you. Don't ask the politicians, because they tend to define and redefine things in their own best interest. As a prop for their governance. There has never been any education revolution. It is a fallacy. Just as there has never been any roadblock revolution. That's a figment of somebody's imagination. But they keep regurgitating these terms because in the back of their mind there appears to be still some concept of radicalism. Some sense of being quote-unquote progressive that compels them, perhaps even cajoles them, into defining and redefining themselves and the things that they do so that they can ultimately feel good. And if they're proficient at writing books, to make sure that they write themselves into their own history. And so they not only parade themselves as a quote-unquote education government, but in true old style and old school political style, the Unity Labour Party has marketed its maximum leader, Generalissimo Ralph Gonsalves, Dr. Salt, as something of a quote-unquote education prime minister. And they've been marketing that garbage for years. And the pervasive nature of the media today, as opposed to 20, 30, 40 years ago, has allowed them to parade that garbage about an education prime minister, an education revolution, an education government. And they hope that people will not apply their critical thinking skills to analyze the reality that surrounds them. But as we begin this segment of our program today, we ask you to bear in mind the number of plywood classrooms that we have existing in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in this day and age, and the growing expanse of more plywood classrooms that you see growing up each day as you pass across the old E.T. Joshua Airport runway. And you wonder what kind of planning do we have in this country that allows us in this day and age to be engaging in that amount of waste of our resources, and what you're seeing developing at Arnorsville over the last few weeks. So we ask you that when you revisit the accolades that are so often showered on Ralph Gonsalves as a quote-unquote education prime minister, and on his ruling regime as a quote-unquote education government, if you apply your critical thinking skills, you will ultimately find yourself concluding that none of those accolades are applicable. None of them is applicable. And we suggest to you today in our program, Just Another Look, that a critical analysis of the education reality in St. Vincent and the Grenadines today would reveal that we have gone the route of most Caribbean countries, the route of any country that we can refer to that commits itself to the mandate of providing for its citizenry the fundamentals: food, clothing, shelter, education, health, and employment. That's what governance is about. Because those are the fundamentals of the human condition. But what we have gotten from the Unity Labour Party is epitomized in the words of the man Aegis Calypso, where he chronicled having come home after Gonzales had gotten into government. And he met them up by the bank where they used to lime. Outside then, what used to be Barclays and now FCIB. Where Phil used to have his first set of selling nuts and other things at South River Road. And how he was encouraged to go across to see what we at Just Another Look first identified as the bridge over troubled water. And the manage in Calypso, his traditional style, recounted that experience with Gonzales. But the manage in his own critical analysis challenged Gonzales in those very early days as to what are you suggesting, what you're doing. That is your work. Who you wanted to fix the bridge. That is part and parcel of your mandate as government. You have to provide the requisite infrastructure. It's not something you boast about. It is something that you have to do as a matter of course. So there's nothing revolutionary or innovative about you fixing a collapsed bridge. But many did not understand the importance of that critical analysis by the managed then, just as they don't understand it now. Why? Because they do not wish to understand. The minions of the Unity Labour Party, following the style of his leadership, does not appear willing to take on board the critical thinking of others. That's how they come across. They are always right. And so when they tell us that we have an education prime minister, that we have an education government, that we have an education revolution, we're supposed to accept it willy-nilly because we don't know any better. For goodness sake, please do not put on your critical thinking hat. Because if you do, we will be exposed for the sham that we are. So what the Unity Labour Party has been quite adept at doing over its years in government is political marketing. The Gobelian strategy, if you tell somebody something often enough, they will believe it to be the truth. However much of a variant of the truth it may be, if it is the truth at all. And over time, that approach, that Gobelian approach, has found many allies and many who are strategically placed to regurgitate the same rubbish of an education prime minister, an education government, and an education revolution. All political trite. And even a most cursory examination of the role that Glenn Jackson unwittingly and at times deliberately played in the history of the Unity Labour Party's accession to the seat of governance in 2001 and again in 2005 would enable you to understand how he used the media to great effect in support of the Unity Labour Party. The same party that later on as a government in 2006 could not furnish his wife with his killer, but instead served her scapegoat justice, and served her scapegoat justice on a political platter. There is no shame and there is no remorse in the fact that one of the critical personalities, one of the most influential personalities in getting the Unity Labour past the polls in 2001 and again in 2005, Glenn Jackson, was brutally murdered, left naked in the back of a vehicle. And the party that he helped catapult into the seat of governance has not yet, 15 years later, been able to provide his wife and the country and the party with the killer. He's dead, so what is your problem? Think for yourself. Isn't that how the party operates? And Just Another Look says, if they do that to their own, what would they do to you? Who are not of them. You see, let us touch on something that has been sensitive. And people who know better, and people who are professional educators, not those who claim to be, have addressed. And that is the common entrance exam. You remember that? Because for decades, not just a few years, for decades, educators, education experts around the Caribbean, and numerous consultants, professionals in education, as well as our own educators here, including the late Winfield Williams, the mighty Ray, have all lamented the chronic problems that the common entrance examination has posed for the well-being of students. They have identified it as a farce when comparing what it achieves for the individual students versus the damage it does to that individual student. Research around the Caribbean and around the world has shown the deleterious effects imposed on successive generations of children by that common entrance exam. And yet successive governments have continued to drive that process. And we will show you during the course of this presentation that all we have done is change the name. A rose by any other name is still a rose. So whether we choose to call it CPEA or SEA or whatever else, it is still the same intent relative to what we are doing to our children in that early stage of their education formation. Interestingly, dear friends, and even as the region's political leaders clamored for their independence and clamored for the change that was supposed to be associated with becoming independent, they have all, one after the other, including our current leader, nonetheless, almost in unison, blindly associated themselves with that type of entrance examination for our students. Embarrassingly, shamelessly, successive generations of so-called quote-unquote political progressives in the Caribbean lauded the introduction and retained the common entrance examination for decades. And Campbell, in analyzing the situation, not Panel Campbell, Campbell in 1997 was quoted as saying that the common entrance exam was perceived by Caribbean leaders, unfortunately, as, quote, a democratizing thrust capable of exerting equalizing pressure on society because it was the mechanism for increased access to secondary school education. End of quote. They just took it willy-nilly from the British, as we have taken so many other things, because we thought that it had something to do with a drive towards social equality, that it was the great equalizer, everybody writing the common entrance exam. The only thing common about it was the piece of paper on which it was written. The questions were common. That's the only thing common about it. And like most intelligence tests, it favored those who came from a background that had already set them up to pass, and that had already set up others to fail. And we've all been able to show the relationship between family background, social background, economic background, and education performance. It wasn't about your intellect in the sense that you were born with some innate intelligence that allowed them on the basis of an IQ test to say that you're bright and others are dumb. But that is what the common entrance did. It justified the use of those quote-unquote intelligence tests to determine who goes where in our education system. In her thesis, in examining education in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, Carew noted, and we quote, "The common entrance exam was implemented as a leveling tool in the movement to expand access to secondary school. It is clear that the exam was instituted as a democratizing tool. And she quotes London, who in 1997 in his study wrote, "Many saw it as a key component in attempts to establish an egalitarian society in Trinidad and Tobago, and that it offered fairness in the transition to secondary school." And we still talking that rubbish, you know. We still talking that. We believe that somehow we have convinced the populace that that is the best way to guarantee fairness in education. It never has, and it never will. The privileged will always be the beneficiaries. And don't worry about those who tell you how much they used to be barefoot. They got nothing to do with it. Those who are anxious to tell you where they came from in order to try to bring your pity because it's pity they need. Carew cites Eric Williams, for example. In 1966, Eric Williams said, and we quote, "The common entrance exam was implemented as a leveling tool in the movement to expand access to secondary school. It is clear that the exam was instituted as a democratizing tool." Eric Williams said, and we quote, "I think we could look forward with a certain amount of pride and confidence to the fact that the secondary school today, with free secondary education and the common qualifying examination, whatever may be said against it by the persons who are familiar with teaching and pedagogy, the fact is that the free secondary school, entrance to which is determined by the common qualifying examination, demonstrates better than anything in this society now or in the future the equality of opportunity for all people, irrespective of racial origin, irrespective of color, and irrespective of one of the fundamental considerations in our society, one of the most potent and vicious forms of discrimination in this society, family status." End of quote. That was Eric Williams. But you know what? He's talking utter rubbish. And that is why he prefaced it by suggesting whatever may be said against it by the persons who are familiar with teaching and pedagogy. That's why he put that in there. Because he knows that he was not on safe ground with people who know about education. But politicians are like that. Because when they hold on to something that they believe is an advancement on what existed before, they do not necessarily take the time to analyze its impact, short, medium, and long term. All they were seeing is that they were convincing the electorate, "Give me another 5 years because you see how good I am." It is the same as saying, "I put on $5 for the pensioners." You see? And then you come together and you say, "Over the years, I put on X amount, X amount, X amount." But you're not factoring in that the $5 can't help them buy much of anything. The average beggar on the street has some business they're going to do today. Don't ask you for 5 cents, 25 cents, or $1. You say, "Give me a 5. That's where we're reached. Even the beggars understand inflation. They know that anything less than $5 can't give them anything much to eat. But you're boasting, "I put on this, I put on that." So that was Eric Williams. But that is reflective and indicative of those political leaders who, because they believe they are somehow intellectually superior, and because they can flash their doctorates on their foreheads, they're bright. And therefore they can twist and turn everything else. And so, to protect himself with the electorate, he says whatever may be said against it by the persons who are familiar with teaching and pedagogy. In other words, don't bother with them. But Carew, in her PhD thesis, says in the first few years after its implementation, the common entrance exam had become to resemble in many respects the college exhibition it was meant to replace. The competition was so stiff that teaching to the test became the norm. Teachers blatantly ignored the primary school curriculum and began preparing students for the exams immediately. The common entrance exam had become the razor death for going to school. In other words, from the time you start going to school, they start letting you know, listen, an exam coming up, you know. And you better pass that, otherwise your goose cook. If you ain't pass common entrance, that's it for you. You lose out. That is still the thinking today. We may call it CPEA, but what's the difference? We may call it all sorts of things, but what is the difference? We scared the children very early into believing that going into the exam room at age 10 or 11 is going to be the sole determinant of what happens to them for the rest of their lives. And we say to you today, if the foregoing sounds familiar, it is. Because we are all familiar with the same scenario in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and indeed in the entire English-speaking Caribbean. That is our reality. We all had, read, and sang from the same education development hymn book. And the entry of Gonzales into the education fray in this country, following his election victory in 2001, saw him seize on the opportunity, now that he was swiveling in the big chair with his hands on the levers of power and government, to appear to wrest the initiative from the former New Democratic Party administration to hasten to move towards universal secondary education. He wanted to impress the nation that, see, I know so much about education. I know so much about the value of education that we're going to have universal secondary education, not over a period of time, but right away. Right away. And in hindsight, for those who are willing to engage in critical thinking, Gonzales merely carted the nation's children further into the pathetic quagmire that essentially destroys them. The common entrance exam was maintained by the Gonzales administration, even though we had gone on to universal secondary education. Despite the political salivation at this achievement, the reality was that nothing changed beyond more children being placed in secondary schools. The mechanism to determine who got to the prestige school remained the same common entrance exam. Despite all the criticism, the same common entrance exam. Now we're calling it CA, but it's still an entrance examination. Arose by any other name. 20 years after becoming the nation's quote-unquote education prime minister, the same schools in St. Vincent and the Grenadines remain the acclaimed prestige institutions, while the others struggle with archaic education teachers and testing methodologies, forcing students to compete for places elsewhere. Today, parents are always Look at their choices for schools. Look at their choices for schools. They know as parents what happens in the country. And if their children falter to be allocated to one of their chosen schools, they move around and find politicians and persons of influence to change their reality. Because they know they are disadvantaged when they go to schools that are lesser ranked than those prestige institutions. Parents are still locked into the ridiculous tradition of pressuring their students from the moment they start schooling into an understanding and a commitment to accessing quote-unquote lessons to guarantee progress, whatever about the psychological damage done to them, because they have to pass to go to secondary school. They have to pass. Because they look around them and they realize that the streaming of children that takes place in the various schools based on the results of the entrance examination, common entrance, CPA, or whatever else name you want to give it, that determines very much their psychological disposition towards learning. Because that same streaming predisposes teachers to teach based on the streams. In an age where child abuse is a crime, our ministers of government, our ministers of education, our parents and our educators do not yet acknowledge in this country that their insistence on the heavy psychological demands on their children constitute a form of child abuse. And we say that without fear of contradiction. What you do to the children is perhaps unforgivable. And over the decades, we have joined the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean in continuing the same tragedy, because that is what it is that we are doing to the children. It is a tragedy. So we have to see common entrance. Don't criticize us for common entrance now, because we have something more modern, something that is more challenging, something that is more egalitarian. We call it the CPEA. What's in a name? What's in a name? And perhaps our leadership here may well be thinking like Eric Williams then, despite what these other people who know about education say, we are telling you this is better for us. So on 8th of May this year, Joel Warrican, professor at the University of the West Indies, Joel Warrican, because he took some time off, came to St. Vincent in the hope of helping at the community college. The less said about that experiment, the better, because he found it important to go back to UWI. We discussed the pros and cons of that on another occasion. But on the 8th of May this year, he couldn't take it anymore. So we had dengue beginning of 2020. Then we followed that up with COVID. We still have COVID. And so as not to be left out globally, we're having all the variants, one after the other. They come in. Don't worry. And then in April, we had Mama Sufre. On the 8th of May, Professor Warrican, Vincentian, at the UWI, couldn't take it anymore. And so he penned a piece under the heading 11 plus and injustice 2. 11 plus and injustice 2. We call it 11 plus examination because people said the exams around that time, right? 10, 11. And it reads in part, the article, well, He's quoted in the article. He didn't pen the article. He's quoted in the article. The article dated 8 May 2021. Professor Joel Warrican says it is an injustice that in the face of trauma from COVID-19 and the ash from Mama Soufriere, pupils are still being made to take the common entrance examination. And that is calling it by any other name. Warrican, the director of the School of Education at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, was critical of the Caribbean Examination Council, CXC, on its stance with regard to CSEC and CAPE exams, which are for the secondary schools, the A-level schools, as well as Caribbean Education Ministry's position on the common entrance. His statement came 2 days after the United Nations Children Fund, UNICEF, the watchdog for children's rights, urged Caribbean ministries of education to prevail upon the CXC to make changes to the exams so as not to disadvantage students. The professor said he was reluctant to enter the debate up until that point, stating that it was laudable that UNICEF had taken up the cause, but pointed out the appeal may be going to the wrong heirs. He stated, quote, "While persons point to the plight of the secondary school age students and the perceived injustice being dealt to them by CXC, I believe that they are overlooking another injustice wrought upon others in a different quarter. And unfortunately, it is to this quarter that UNICEF is appealing. Here, he says, I am speaking of the injustice perpetuated by said ministries of education that in the face of all the trauma have still found a way of ensuring that primary school students write the common entrance exam known by different names in different countries in the region, but the same beast. But the same beast. That included us, said Vincent Dunigan. He was here, working at a community college. Warrican, dear friends, was not just shocked by this nonsense. He was annoyed as an educator to find that, and we quote, ministries of education are finding it convenient and safe for these children to return to in-person classes in schools in the third term of the academic year so that they can be, quote unquote, adequately prepared to write this screening test. They really care about you. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we wanted to make sure it happened. So, having used schools for shelters, we went and found community centers, churches, any kind of open space we could to have the children go through this traumatic experience. You already have one set, multiple traumas. Dengue on the one hand, COVID-19 and its variants on the other, and on top of that, volcanic ash and the horrors of not knowing how much damage Soufriere would have done to all of us, including the children. But for goodness sake, just find a way anyway, put them someplace and have the exam, because without that we don't know what to do with them. So and we put them through another trauma. That is leadership in this country. Ours would have been particularly pathetic. But we see nothing wrong with it. Because education is not important. What is important is that we give the impression that we know what we are doing. And we sell it as something that is organized as a progressive pathway, a development strategy on the part of our government. That is the nonsense that we continue to sell our nation. So why are we surprised that parliamentarians sat there and enjoyed the fact that police came and fling Daniel Cummins down the step? It doesn't matter that he may not be able to walk again for the rest of his life or be able to use his limbs properly. It does not matter. Because we market our politics as it suits our pride and purposes, because we sit and swivel in the big chair and we have mouth to talk. It is the retention of emphasis by the likes of government ministers and ministries, who, by the way, are ultimately answerable to their prime ministers, could, in the midst of the pandemic, still insist on having the children come out to do the exams that Warwick labels, quote unquote, the screening test. In an amazingly critical and cryptic manner, Warwick explained that while most English-speaking Caribbean countries report of having different types of continuous assessment in primary schools, the examination alone remained the unshakable and relied on means of transferring students to secondary schools as a fair system. That's what we do. If you have the hopeful purpose of continuous assessment is that during children's career, they are assessed. You don't have to wait on one critical exam on that particular fateful day to write them off. And Warwick rejects that. He says, I wish to contend that rather than being fair, it is unjust. I wish to contend that rather than being fair, it is unjust, as it perpetuates a system of elitism that ensures that students from certain backgrounds are awarded places in prestigious schools while the others are farmed out to schools that are under-resourced and undervalued. Warwick's annoyance with what obtains compelled him to ask, on what moral grounds will ministries of education that uphold this inequitable system appeal to the Caribbean Examination Council? You can't appeal because you are part and parcel of the problem. You're not part of the solution. On what moral grounds will ministries of education that uphold this inequitable system appeal to CXC? And he asked, am I the only one seeing the hypocrisy in such an appeal? Should it be tendered? Am I the only one who recognizes the hypocrisy? Is the English-speaking Caribbean talking to, inclusive of his own native citizens and the Grenadines? It must be hurting his heart to see what has become of us as a people, and what passes for leadership, what passes for governance, what passes for education. In a truly educational analysis, Warwick then asked whether secondary schools, especially those boasted of having continuous assessment, could justify the need to have students return to the classroom in the pandemic to prepare for promotion exams. In other words, what is the real purpose of continuous assessment exercises that the schools claim to have been doing throughout the academic year? Warwick says, and we quote, even in normal times, and these are not normal times, even in normal times, this system of high-stakes examinations plays havoc with the mental and psychological state of students. I wish to submit that in these unprecedented times of COVID-19 and volcanic eruptions, the toll that King Examinations is taking on students is even higher. Where are our education psychologists? We put them in schools as what? Guidance counselors, no? But we need some education psychologists to tell the ministers of education, to tell the ministers of governance of the foolishness that they are doing with regard to the future of our children. The fact that the examination culture is deeply ingrained in the collective psyche of the region's people has become a trump card for the CXC, for ministries of education, and to a lesser extent schools. Yes, eh? Yeah, that's Morrican, Vincentian educator. The fact that the examination culture is deeply ingrained in the collective psyche of the peoples of this region has become a trump card for the CXC, for the ministries of education, and to a lesser extent schools. So that, he says, whenever examinations are quote-unquote threatened, as they were with the COVID and the volcanic eruption, the notion of quote-unquote fairest way is invoked, and the support of the masses tends to be thrown behind the perpetuation of the reign of the king examination. We don't really care about the children, We make the parents feel that we do, but we don't care about them. We don't care about them. Because if something goes wrong with them mentally, we throw them in the Red Roof Inn. Nothing wrong with that as far as the government is concerned. That's where they belong. Even if we have a hint that something is wrong. Isn't that what we did with Yuki Farrell? For something that should have been treated as a domestic dispute, because if a man put a woman in a house or apartment for how long, whether or not he have a wife and children in one place and he taking care of this other one, and there's a problem. It's a domestic dispute in between the two of them. Right? But our reaction was to say you're not mentally fit. Go and do a mental evaluation. Go and do a mental evaluation. Warwican says he was disappointed in the Caribbean Examination Council for not finding creative ways of certifying students. Indeed, he says, when an attempt at this was made in 2020, the outcome was disastrous, causing great anxiety among students, their parents, and their teachers. What made the situation even worse was CXC's attempt to defend their indefensible actions in a manner that many felt was arrogant, disrespectful, and uncaring. It is unfortunate that this same attitude is discernible in CXC's behavior this year, which is 2021. We had parents and others complaining about CXC in 2020. Right? What did Vincentian say? What level of challenge did we mount? And so he concludes that CXC needs to develop friendlier models that maintain the integrity of the certification and which are not so heavily dependent on examinations come hell or high water. And that ministries hold CXC more accountable. We would add, and that ministries hold themselves more accountable. So here is an experienced Vincentian University professor acknowledging that he has reached a stage where he can no longer stand and lay by and support the travesty that passes for education in our Caribbean. And we include St. Vincent and the Grenadines in that. And 20 plus years of Gonzalez leadership, even under the weeping willow mantra of an education prime minister, the Vincentian education system reality remains the archaic centerpiece of what passes as an integral component of ULP development. But here it is, just in case you think that we're making joke. On September 2nd this year, 2021, just a few days ago, Gonzalez writes something and it ended up in Eyewitness News on the 2nd of September. We don't know if he wrote it on the 2nd of September. It was in the Eyewitness News online document on the 2nd of September. This is Gonzalez, 2021. We're not sure why he wrote it, right? But in it, he says in part, quote, "In this context, the working people, including public servants, have advanced magnificently in every material respect, inclusive of education and training, poverty reduction, nourishment, electricity, water, sanitation, blah, 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 blah." Right? And then in the same article, he says, quote, "Enhancing markedly the benefits for the working people and their children through a bundle of government programs, including those in education, health, social security, poverty reduction, etc." More or less repeating the same thing. Right? The point we want to make here is that here is the Prime Minister in 2001, September, lauding the achievements of St. Vincent and the Grenadines under the ULP government. And the entire article that this erstwhile quote-unquote education prime minister leading a quote-unquote education government under a quote-unquote education revolution, the best he could have done regarding education as a vehicle for the nation's developmental transformation after 20 years is mention the word education twice in the article. He may have mentioned it more, but we didn't see it. Maybe it's there. But from an education prime minister in an education government under an education revolution, that the achievements are so manifold that education barely gets mentioned. Examination of the piece shows that that is all that he could serve up. Because he's claiming in that same piece that the Unity Labour Party, quote, espouses a progressive working people's philosophy of advanced social democracy appropriately fashioned to the context of our Caribbean civilization and the extant political economy of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It possesses a compelling strategic many-sided developmental narrative reflective of the philosophy, policies, and programs which undergird it. End of quote. What did he just say there? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. You hear how fancy it sounds? That is the kind of thing that Just Another Look, in our opinion, refer to as fluff. Fluff. Or put another way, we may refer to it as erudite vacuity. Absolute nothing being said, but done in a very nice way. We repeat it, that the Unity Labour Party, quote, espouses a progressive working people's philosophy of advanced social democracy appropriately fashioned to the context of our Caribbean civilization and the extant political economy of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It possesses a compelling strategic, many-sided developmental narrative reflective of the philosophy, policies, and programs which undergird it. Absolutely nothing said there at all. But it sounds nice, right? It sounds like it comes from somebody who's highly educated. Okay? But that is essentially what we would choose to call erudite vacuity. Saying nothing nicely. It is Gonzalez who declared in the same piece, quote, strategically, the ULP government embarked upon a quest to build a modern, competitive, many-sided, post-colonial economy, which is at once national, regional, and global in our people's interest. End of quote. Exactly what he said there. Exactly what did he say here? You see, in the working people's interest, in this country, for all that has been said and done, we ask, in this little piece that ended up in Eyewitness News on the 2nd of September, the online Eyewitness News, education, which one got the impression was the main platform on which the social transformation, the economic transformation, and whatever other transformation would have taken place, because the ULP government was a transformative government, whatever about consultative democracy, that we would have heard more about education. But you see, things so hot these days, people in the streets for all sorts of different reasons. And he knows only too well, because it happened under him in 2000. That when the people get on the street for one thing, a lot of other causes are brought in. A lot of other causes are heaped on it. Right? If you follow the historical recordings of the 1930s and the labor riots in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as in most of the other Caribbean countries, the final straw was something that appeared insignificant. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they keep talking about, imagine the whole thing start over the cost of a box of matches. That may be so. But it is all of the other things that have been building up underneath over time that makes the whole thing into a huge powder keg. It doesn't matter what is the last straw that breaks the camel back. And you saw that in 2000, in April, May. You saw a number of things heaping up. April, May 2000 didn't just happen because Gonzalez felt that he could talk some nonsense about a roadblock revolution. It wasn't just about the salaries and wages. This was something that was building up before, so that in 1998, it manifested itself in the New Democratic Party having lost the electoral majority at the polls, while getting a slender one-seat majority and insisting that it will form government. The writing was on the wall in terms of the loss of the popular vote. Yeah? And since that time, that commitment to make the country ungovernable resonated with those who had gotten tired of the New Democratic Party. So one issue after another came and heaped up on each other until the cataclysmic conclusion, the powder keg of April, May 2000. Boom. They want to give more salaries to parliamentarians while we on the street, while we in teaching and public servants can't get assistance. Boom. That came together. The people who, the bus drivers with their things, the road condition, but one thing heap up on another. And he Gonzalez knew that because he was the one talking about the greed, the graft, the corruption, the this, the that, and heaped all of those things together. In a similar vein, comrade, you as a student of history know that your loss of the popular electoral majority is similar to what happened to you on the other foot to the NDP in 1998. It's your turn. And so the people are heaping different things together. They're coming on the street not because necessarily of the COVID thing. That is the tinderbox now. That is the match that is triggering the change, my brother. And you know that only too well. And that is why perhaps in your piece on the achievements, what are you trying to achieve? You're trying to tell people now of all the things you have done for them. People not interested in that, my brother. And you know that. And your once favored comrades, or not so favored comrades, the ruminants of the left and the leftover, are now trying again to try to blow the match out. And they can't. Because the masses have taken on. The issues are now brought together, and they are what are driving the masses. But in the working people's interests, education gets thrown in with a lot of other things. But if you wish to know the true status of the abysmally poor job of the Unity Labour Party with regard to education, go down and look at what is happening at the E.T. Joshua Airport Street. We're building plywood institutions. You know why? We're building plywood institution at a pace down at the Arnoldville, Old Arnoldville Airport. Because now, 20 years later, after having recognized that what we did in 2001, 2002 of rushing to universal secondary education in a rapid fire mode without the adequate resources. Remember, we transformed primary school today, like Richmond Hill Primary, into a secondary school tomorrow, that kind of thing. Remember, that's what we did, you know? And we had to put plywood classrooms here and yon. Instead of having taken the gradual approach that was recommended by the New Democratic Party and Winston King and so on, while Professor Winston King, while he was here, advising the New Democratic Party in that period under Annie Eustace as to the gradual approach towards universal secondary education. We fast-track it. And what happened? The grammar school repairs that should have been done, the comprehensive repairs that should have been done, hadn't been done. And now the roof is caving in, right? So they have to repair that. They didn't change the old part of the Richmond Hill Primary School. They left that as it was and then built a concrete part at the bottom. So now the old part, the flooring gone, the place is ridiculous. You're only waiting for somebody to perhaps fall through the floor. So you have to fix that. And so many schools we have to fix. So now we're going to be playing musical chairs because grammar school has to go down Arnoldville for a period of time. At least they're starting the first term. Thomas Saunders had to go down there for a period of time. So we play musical chairs. One go in, one come out, or two go in and two come out, that kind of thing, until we fix the schools in the way in which we should have done originally. Have we saved any money? Doubtful. Because remember, this is a government where when you ask for accountability for things like the airport and those other things, you have difficulty getting it. The audit is always so many years behind, and then we hear that the Auditor General doesn't have the access to the kind of modern technology that is necessary to make the work faster, etc., etc. And you wonder if all of these things is part of a plan or if it is just VAPs, right? So what you see on Arnoldville is a colossal waste. We could have avoided that. Yeah? But that is consistent with what we are saying about the way this government operates. It is the reason why people are taking to the streets. They recognize the wastage. So we're paying now 20 years later. Understand? That's why manage was correct. We're now doing what we should have done in the first place. Had we taken the time and done it systematically in a developmental way, we would not be hustling to do the nonsense we are doing, wasting resources at Arnersville with plywood institutions. Yeah? And so the discommoding of people now, 20 years later. But you see, when you sell it to the people that we know we're doing the best for you, we ask, where is the accountability? Give us the accountability for the airport. Then give us the accountability for your plywood schools. Give us the accountability for what you're doing now with these new plywood institutions, right? And the costings of what you're doing. Then tell us exactly what changes are you making, and are they long-term? Will the roof in the grammar school really be fixed? Or are you putting a roof over an existing roof and leaving what is old and rather ridiculous still inside here? Let's look at it. Let's look at that more closely. Right? In an earlier edition, we talked about the plywood empire of Ralph Gonsalves. Because we also need to call him the plywood king. Because it's a plywood empire that he has. He may be world boss, but he's probably the world boss of plywood schools, of plywood institutions, of a plywood empire. Right? We says that the newly elected ULP did not appear anxious to reveal that the new Democratic Party had begun the process of moving to universal secondary education, and that they had proposed it be implemented in phases. Right? But with the ULP maintaining the NDP's initiative in respect of education as something of a well-guarded secret, they set about a rebranding exercise. The rebranding was to fast-track the process of universal secondary education. Schools were hastily transformed from being primary education institutions at one point to secondary institutions in another. Just as suddenly as the project started, so too it was discovered that more secondary school places had to be immediately manufactured. Thus it was that the concept of plywood classrooms was born, a product of the politically innovative ideas of the Gonsalves regime. Many in the Ascension Society began labeling some institutions plywood schools, even if the majority of the construction was still of concrete. Interestingly, little attention was paid to the complaints of those who felt that not enough time was taken to analyze the impact on both students and teachers. In many respects, we said, the project gained traction and support from the supporters of the ULP, largely because they were all still caught up in the euphoria of the election victory that swept the NDP out of office. The plywood system was effectively started and has been expanding ever since, until now, when the system had essentially stymied and, like a cold engine on a rainy morning, chokes all too frequently. Gonsalves' plywood empire is now being exposed for what it really was and what it remains today. End of quote. We said that some months ago in one of our editions of Just Another Look. But it seems we wanted an education revolution, just as we had a roadblock evolution. Everything must be done immediately. And now we have to build plywood institutions while we do what we should have done in the first place, carefully and gradually upgrade then existing education infrastructure and construct new ones based on scientific analysis of future trends. But then again, why should we? That requires planning. That requires critical thinking. Do we have time for that under the ULP? Or are we too busy swiveling in the big chair to the point where we have become truly, decidedly giddy? We ought to call a spade what it is, just a spade. The infrastructure now being constructed at Arnersville, home to the proposed new city, is now being crafted as an extension of what Just Another Look labels the Gonsalves Plywood Empire, a true legacy to his vision for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But the old people say, what you sow is that you go reap. Dear listeners, we ask you, dear listeners, you be the judge. Today, the 11th day of September 2021, marks 5,369 days since the disappearance of SVG Air J8VAX. Dominic Gonzalez was the pilot. Rashid Ibrahim had taken a lift with him. They both disappeared without a trace. Today marks 4,059 days since the disappearance of another SVG Air aircraft, J8SXY, a Cessna 402. Disappeared on Thursday, the 5th of August 2010. The pilot, Suresh Lakram. But just another look wishes to leave our listeners with a sad reminder that we are fast approaching the 13th anniversary of the gruesome death of Patricia Bowman, wife of Alban Bowman. Remember, dear friends, that it was on the 19th of September 2008 that Alban Bowman, her husband, was sent into shock following receipt of the news of the cruel death of his wife after he would spend the whole day trying to find her. She was crushed to death as rubble from a collapsing wall fell on her car while on her way to work in Ratomil. For us, that remains a stinging reminder of the lack of care in this country. Yes, we lack the duty of care. We may think otherwise, but we really do lack the duty of care. Let's remember Patricia Bowman. Just as we remember Suresh Lakram, called out from home to take J8SXY on a mercy mission, only to lose his life in doing so. Dominic Gonzalez and Rashid Ibrahim, trying to reach home. Rashid, knowing that his mother was waiting for him at Annesville, and his flight was late, accepted a ride from Dominic Gonzalez. They both disappeared. You know, we talk about justice in this society of ours. But do we really have justice? Do we? Enough said. You'll be listening to another edition of Nice Radio's Callaloo presentation, Just Another Look. Just Another Look is an innovative, exciting, albeit decidedly provocative and yes, certainly controversial, socio-political analysis of issues of a local, regional, and international nature. Just Another Look is heard only on Nice Radio, first aired on Saturdays at 6 p.m., with repeat broadcasts on Sundays at 9. Remember, catch us on the World Wide Web, www.niceradio.info. Check us out on Facebook and YouTube. I am, of course, Keith Joseph.